The station turned slowly above the Asher world, a silver ring with bones of light. It was supposed to be a refuge, a neutral ground where memories didn't bleed and old enemies learned to breathe through the same recycled air. The war had ended 120 years ago, long enough for children to grow old under ceilings of glass, yet somehow the Orion Verge still carried its scars among the stars. Out past the docking arms, where tugs drifted like flies, the planet's storms chased themselves into fraying spirals, and lightning stitched the atmosphere with temporary roads no one would dare to walk. In a quiet berth near the outer rim, a woman awakened from the sleep of transit and felt the ship's hum as a familiar pulse beneath her feet. Captain Mara Vance didn't look like salvation, and she certainly didn't feel it. She kept her uniform simple despite the fleet patches she was entitled to wear. She had the sort of face that, even when learning the worst, never quite lost the habit of softening at the corners as if promising she would carry the weight for you anyway. It was why she'd been chosen, or maybe why she'd been spared. She stepped into a corridor where the light ran in a narrow thread across the floor and stopped at the world's edge, an illuminated threshold before a darker, wider unknown. On the other side of that light waited a tribunal liaison, his posture too stiff to be friendly. Behind him, a pair of station stewards wore polished visors that erased whatever faces lived beneath. The liaison held a slate, the kind that could carry a lifetime of commitments if you touched it once with your name. "Captain Vance," he said, throat tight around a crisp accent that imagined itself above the dust and noise of mortal lives. "Thank you for coming on such short notice." She took in the hall, the acoustic hush, the distant murmur of turbines, small thunder of a departing ship felt through the bones. "You mentioned urgency." "We did," he said, and glanced at the stewards. He led her through a diplomatic wing lined with windows. Outside, the planet turned, its storms mottled like bruises. Inside, the hallway smelled faintly of steel and clean water, regulated as if breath itself were a treaty. When they stopped before a reinforced door, the liaison hesitated. "I should prepare you for she's difficult." "Difficult," Mara echoed, flat but not unkind. "People often are when we make their first day a cage." The liaison's mouth opened, closed. He keyed the door. The room beyond was designed not to look like a cell and failed anyway. The walls were soft gray and seamless, the texture of compliance. The ceiling diffused light like a cloud that had never held rain. There was a table, a chair. On the floor sat a figure as if the furniture and the room's expectations did not exist. She was too long-limbed for comfort, all balance and boiled sinew beneath a shell of perfect stillness. Her skin wasn't skin. It was something between polished obsidian and deep water, as if constellations had been etched inside her and the light couldn't quite escape. Where hair should have been, thin metallic cords fell in braided lines, clinking softly when she moved. Mara had read the brief. An Aeledri, genetically uplifted from a world with 6 small suns and 1,000 feral stories, a people whose history with humanity was complicated. Their fleets had once sided with humanity's enemies, not out of malice but pride and calculation. They'd found both qualities unsuited to war. What was left of them wandered the outer lanes, bargaining secrets for breathing room. The tribunal called the pairing program intercultural rehabilitation. The border called it something else. The Aeledri lifted her head. Her eyes were not alien in shape, only in the way they held light without reflection, a patient deepness that did not announce what it knew. "You came," she said. The liaison stepped forward as if to claim the moment. "Captain Vance, this is Subject 087 Beta, Provisional Clemency Holder under Act." "Mara," the human said, gently cutting him off. "I'm Mara Vance, and you are the one I am required to choose." The Aeledri's voice wasn't cold so much as distilled of anything unnecessary. "For the record, my chosen name is Irid." Mara crouched so they were nearer the same height. "Irid, that's yours, not assigned." "It is what I remembered when they asked what should be said to me," Irid replied. "I found it sufficient." She tilted her head. "You are a spacer. Your left knee remembers an impact your mind pretends to have forgotten." Mara almost smiled. "And you read people." She glanced at the liaison. "We'll need a few moments, alone." The man began to protest. Something in Mara's look, something that had carried charges through combat corridors and made enemy fire an inconvenience rather than a judgment, retaught him how to be silent. He gestured the stewards back, and the door slid shut with a whisper of control. Mara sat, not in the chair, but on the floor opposite Irid, cross-legged like a child scheming with a friend. "You're being forced to choose a human partner. The tribunal doesn't say it that way, but then they don't like words that refuse to forgive them." Irid's chords chimed softly when her shoulders lifted. "They say I must pair for cultural exchange. If I do, I am no longer an enemy of the border. If I do not, they return me to a ship bound for no one's planet." That's close to the truth. Mara studied the Aeledri's hands, long, jointed differently, capable of crushing or of the kind of intricate work that made machines envy the patience of living fingers. "Why me?" Irid's gaze flicked to the side as if sorting through several answers, discarding most. "The list compiled by your administrators contained 6 names. 2 would fear me, 1 would resent me, 1 would try to worship me, 1 would want to break me. You will carry me, and you will not make me carry you." Mara could have said many things about being carried and the myth that strength was the absence of need. Instead, she nodded once. "Then let's sign their paper and make it ours." They touched their names to the slate. The device chimed, indifferent to the binding of 2 lives. The tribunal explained the rules with the weary thoroughness of men who feared exceptions. Irid would reside on Mara's patrol ship, the Gallant, a corvette small enough to fit into trouble. She would wear a translator implant keyed to both their languages. She would not leave the ship without permission in the first 90 days. She would not access secure files. She would report any contact with former Aeledri affiliates or men who wanted to become such. There were concessions, too. Irid would be allowed personal objects. She had none. Ritual observances, she had few, and the right to refuse medical procedures except in emergencies, a clause hard won by 1,000 others whose names weren't on any slate. Perhaps the most important sentence was the one that seemed least necessary. Partners would be considered peers in the eyes of the tribunal, with neither party subordinate to the other except in the fulfilling of the ship's rank structure. The brief didn't say what would happen if peers broke. When the last signature faded into the slate, they walked out into the station's wider air. At the docking spines, the Gallant rested like a knife sheathed in night, hull patched in places with a different era's materials. Mara loved it as people love siblings, bruised, infuriating, essential. Irid paused beside the airlock and pressed her hand to the hull as if it were a throat she could read by vibration alone. "She listens," Irid said. "She groans," Mara corrected. "She'll groan louder if we don't get off this ring before the traffic window closes." Inside, the ship's corridors were narrow, thick with the layered smell of machine oil and cleaners, and the ghost of meals cooked in cramped galas. Irid moved like a dancer who had learned to be a shadow, her chords chiming when she ducked under a low beam. Mara watched her catalog features, the railings polished by hands, the burn patch on a bulkhead from a long-ago electrical tantrum, the dents where crew had thrown their hopeless fear and hit nothing that could be hurt back. The Gallant had a crew of 8. They didn't stare, exactly, but they required a second to understand Irid and to admit the understanding. Mara introduced them one by one in the cramped mess. Raised the flight tech, whose patience could outlast radiation. Stoker the engineer, whose heart lived somewhere under a layer of grease even he couldn't reach. Kaido the navigator, cheerful in that peculiar way of men who measure their lives in numbers and don't mind the math. Elson, the quartermaster, old enough to remember a different galaxy and young enough to choose hope anyway, and the twins Jessa and Ven, who kept the weapons honest and the munitions moderately prayed over. There was also Dr. Pell, who spoke least and worked most, a woman who forgot to fear sleep because she didn't have time to meet it. Irid, Mara said simply as they ate, is with us. She's not a weapon, a trophy, or a warning. She's crew. The twins nodded together like a pair of birds reading the weather. Reyes raised 2 fingers. Welcome aboard. Pell glanced up, her eyes surprisingly gentle. Elson slid a bowl of stew across the table without judgment. Kaido grinned the way navigators do when they've memorized the stars and still pretend to be surprised at beauty. Irid's gaze moved from face to face like the slow sweep of a lighthouse. She learned the shape of each person the way she learned a corridor, noticing where the air grew warmer by degrees and where it hinted at a draft. She said little, but when she spoke, it was always a precise placing of truth. You laugh at storms because someone told you they are simply weather. You tell yourself you are not lonely by becoming useful. You measure your courage in parts you can fix with your hands. And always there was a gentleness, something Mara had not yet earned and already depended on. They lifted from station in a clean burn, sliding through traffic like a fish that has learned the river's stubbornness. Below, the planet hurled storms at itself and caught them again. Above, the verge hosted caravans of commerce reassembling into fragile futures. The gallant's orders were simple until they weren't. Sweep the edge of Sector Yarrow, respond to distress signals, investigate rumors of piracy or worse. Work that required vigilance and sometimes violence, but mostly the refusal to be bored by the duty of keeping others alive. At first, Irid was a passenger. She watched Mara in the command chair and seemed to map the rhythm of the ship's days. The watches, the coffee there was never enough of, the way crew moved around one another without asking because they'd already learned to. If she was captured by some thought, she didn't present it for dissection. She spent hours in engineering with Stoker, listening to the reactor cradle murmur its ancient lullaby. Sometimes Mara found her in the observation blister, sitting motionless where the stars poured down, cords lying across her shoulders like a cloak of many lines. Hearts recognized their own unpredictable work. Over the days, the crew stopped being careful around Irid and began being honest. When trouble finally came, it arrived as a whisper on a band no one listened to unless their gut made them. Reyes heard it first, a stammering burst of encoded static that sounded like a man at the end of language. He caught it, cleaned it, handed it to Kaido, who stared at the timestamp and swallowed. They fed it into the ship's small brain. Words assembled. Flare, drift oxygen at 2%, borders please anyone. Mara stood without thinking to admire the way fear could pretend to be calm. Location. Kaido dragged lines with fingers that seemed to know distance by taste. Closest relay puts it near the Penumbra Drift. That's a bad neighborhood. The Penumbra Drift was a graveyard of ships and promises, a place where magnetic eddies tangled compasses and shadows learned to grow teeth. To go there for salvage was a kind of economy. To go there for rescue was a gamble with odds the house had forgotten how to count. Mara didn't glance at Irid. She didn't need to. Plot an approach, minimal signature, assume hostiles, raise, bring up the ghosts. Let anyone watching think we're parts and not a ship. Reyes nodded, hands already teasing the stealth shroud into place with the greed of a magician. Stoker muttered to the engine in a language that had more grease than grammar. The twins checked loadouts and hummed a listless hymn to ammunition. We are flying into a trap, Irid observed, mild as weather. Likely, Mara agreed. So let's be the worst bait they've tasted. Why? Irid asked, and there wasn't defiance in it. Only the asking a child makes before the story has taught them all the reasons that end in love. Because someone asked, Mara said. Irid looked down at her long fingers as if counting the bones she'd been given. She stood. Then let me not be a passenger. "What can you do?" Stoker asked, the question honest, not skeptical. Irid's eyes seemed to take the light in and keep it. "I can hear ships. I can speak to fields. I can find quiet where other minds see only noise." She hesitated, chords chiming softly. "And I can kill, very cleanly. I would rather not. But if that is the alphabet we must use to spell survival, I know the letters." Mara watched her as the gallant slid into the drift's outer dark. "Your choice, always." They bled speed and let the shadows accept them. Through the blister, the wreckage of a dozen wars and 100 greedier mornings drifted in a slow choir of ruin. Hulls without names, their paint scoured by the windless weather of radiation, antennas bent into prayers that had not been answered, cargo pods open like mouths. The distress signal pulsed, weak as an injured animal calling without hope. Kaido found the ship by listening for absence, the way a hunter hears where a forest refuses to speak. It was a medevac carrier, small, built to be quick rather than brave. Someone had chewed holes into her hull. She drifted with a ragged spin, a slow carousel of doom. A salvage rig clung to her like a parasite, and in the rig's wake were 3 smaller craft the color of bad intentions. Boarders, Rays confirmed. Signatures matched the Karkeen marauders. Elson sniffed. Karkeen are sloppy, but sloppy can kill you when you're tired or kind. Alive on the medevac, Pell's voice had a weight to it, a refusal to pretend. Ray's hands moved fast. "I'm seeing heat signatures, low, scattered." "Then we go," Mara said. They went. The gallant slid in under the rig's shadow and kissed the medevac's flank with a docking umbilical. The first curse of boarding is the brittle silence of your own breath turning into the only drum that matters. The second is the way your mind tries to describe the bullet that will kill you before it arrives. The twins took point, faces blank the way priests are when their gods require an old story to be retold. Mara went after them, Irid at her shoulder like a long shadow choosing to be faithful. The medevac's corridors were full of floating debris. A clip of syringes, a child's knitted cap with its warmth long fled, a string of icon beads someone had cut with a knife. They found the first body by the hatch, eyes wide in the way of men who have tried to see their death and found it too close to focus on. Pell knelt and worked and shook her head because even miracles need time. They found the first living in a storage room with the latch jammed by a hunger for life that had bent metal. She was young, a medic, her hair shaved to keep it out of her hands. She stared at Mara with a stunned gratitude that made the room feel too small. "Others?" Mara asked. She swallowed. 3, maybe 4. I lost count when they started." Irid lifted a hand. Quiet. The gallant's crew froze as if turned to statues molded from sweat and readiness. Irid tilted her head, chords chiming. "They brought an interference field. That is how they make easy prey, but the device is old, and it speaks the same weak language as your stealth shroud, Rays. It can be confused." "Can you do it?" Mara asked. "Yes," Irid said, "but I will need to leave my body sleeping." Mara didn't ask what that meant. Some questions were a slow kind of violence. "Do it." Irid's eyes closed. She did not topple. She simply became less. Not gone, not absent. As if the gravity of herself had been redirected so that it anchored something else. The air changed. The corridor's hum picked up a second drumbeat. In the distance, the interference field stuttered, considered the fact of confusion, then decided to be mortal after all. Now, the twins said as one. They moved. At the salvage rig's spine, the Karkeen were busy with cruelty, which makes people slow. The first fell to Ven's round, the second to Jessa's knife that caught a throat like a question answered too late. The third turned and fired and caught Mara's shoulder with a glancing, burning kiss. Pell was there, a bandage already in her hand like a premonition. Elson laid down, suppressing fire that sounded absurdly like a sewing machine. Down. Rays barked, and a trip mine took the ceiling instead of their faces. Irid opened her eyes and went forward, not fast, but in a way that made the space choose to help her. She reached for the interference field device, a box cobbled by greed and fear, and cut its power with a touch that made the lights flicker in respect. The Karkeen commander saw a prize become a problem and aimed. He never finished the motion. After, the medevac carrier felt less like a tomb. They found a child in a cryo cot, and a man who had refused to leave the engines because his hands felt obliged to keep anything that could be warmth from becoming cold. They found a woman clutching a small relic that meant home in a language Mara did not speak. All told, they walked 7 living souls back across the umbilical, and it was not enough, and it was everything. In the mess, where victory always tastes like exhaustion, the survivors drank warm broth and remembered how to be human under artificial light. The medic looked at Irid over the rim of her cup, eyes wide the way people's eyes get when they realize they are alive and must now decide what that means. She whispered. You're one of them. Irid nodded. I am one of me. She paused. And I am with them. Her hand indicated the gallant's crew. The medic's gaze moved to Mara, whose shoulder was patched and throbbing in that intimate way pain learns your name. Thank you. Mara only shook her head. She didn't believe in thanks. She believed in continuing. The station at the edge of the drift accepted the survivors and sent a message to the tribunal that was mostly relief and partially bureaucracy. The gallant refueled, took on a new set of ration packs that tasted like optimism had died on the assembly line, and followed a thread of rumors into deeper space. Where the Karkeen scavenged, others fed. Where a medevac was a target, a colony ship could be a feast. Mara slept in snatches and woke already moving. Irid watched the stars like a cat listens to her house at night. The partnership program had rules. One of them required weekly sessions with a counselor whose job straddled empathy and surveillance. His name was Joran Vale, and he worked out of a tidy office that tried too hard to pretend it was an event in a bureaucratic machine. He had a face you wanted to trust and a voice that might have been a lullaby elsewhere. How are you adapting? He asked, looking from Mara to Irid in turns. Mara said, we're alive and working. Irid said nothing for a long breath. You ask that as if adaptation were a curve with a beginning and a point on a graph where we stop and celebrate. My people change like mountain weather. Your people change like fires in dry season. Both are dangerous, and both keep the world from falling asleep. Joran scribbled something on his slate that was probably not poetry. There are concerns in certain quarters that integration with Aeledri may compromise human crews. Mara's jaw moved without her permission. We just dragged 7 bodies out of a boarding party's jaws. And left 4 behind. Irid said softly, this too must be counted. Joran cleared his throat. I only mean to ask how this partnership is functioning. It is functioning, Irid replied. How? He pressed, almost kind. Irid tilted her head as if reading the shape of his question in the air. I do a thing and Mara respects the thing done rather than the hand that did it. She does a thing and I learn why her species bares its teeth when it is not angry. We both refuse to be the first to ask if this is enough. We continue. Mara suppressed a smile. We continue, she confirmed. Joran leaned back. Very well, keep me informed. They did not. 2 weeks later, the gallant caught the tail of something too organized to be raiders and too sloppy to be a nation. Ships without transponders prowled the transit lanes between small settlements, lighter than Navy cruisers, heavier than pirate craft. They hit and faded. They took cargo and people and left a calling card. A small emblem painted in a red that dried too glossy, a stylized gate with 3 bars across it. No one recognized the sigil. Everyone felt it meant a door was being closed, somewhere they could not see. Gatebreakers. Elson named them, because old soldiers know that naming is a way to make your fear get up off the couch and do the dishes. Whoever they are, they prefer to ambush near gravity wells. Then we be the gravity they require, Mara said. They set a trap at the edge of a minor jump point, one of those places navigators use when they are either clever or desperate. The Gallant drifted on minimal power. Heat bled into space like a gasp. Rays pretended to be a broken mining tug. Stoker whispered into the engine until it agreed to be very, very quiet. Kaido watched the scopes the way a gambler watches hands. Irid sat with the Gallant's brain and listened. She had learned the difference between the ship's other voices and its own. The creak that meant stress that was not danger. The hum that meant contentment disguised as inertia. The quickly stifled whine that meant something had wanted to fail and changed its mind. She had learned the crew's textures, too. Ven's mind like coiled wire, strong but ready to spring. Jess's something like a drum that wanted to be thunder and could be if asked. Elson's slow-burning fire. Ray's a set of keys. Mara's was stormlight, dangerous and warm. Beautiful and likely to draw lightning, but somehow never letting go of the ground. When the Gatebreakers came, they emerged from shadow like sharks who thought they were entitled to every mouthful of ocean. 3 ships, fast, lean, painted the matte gray of disinterest. They moved to pounce on the fake tug and discovered it was armored more heavily than any miner could love. By then the Gallant had uncurled and shown teeth. The first exchange of fire felt like breaking a rule, and finding the rule had been unnecessary. The second exchange was worse. The Gatebreakers were good. They hammered the Gallant's shields, danced around her nose, all gall and geometry. The twins were deadly, but even deadly can be outmaneuvered by men who practice cruelty like an algebra. Stoker cursed at the engine until the engine became angry at the correct things. Kaido threaded the Gallant between enemy fire like a needle claiming its right to stitch. Mara watched it all and made a choice. "We board," she said. "Captain," Rays began. "We board," she repeated, and there was no room in that voice for the kind of fear that used to live with her under the bed. "Rays, you and Kaido keep them distracted. Twins, pack light. Irid, here," Irid said, already moving. They crossed over on a grapple that didn't ask permission. The Gatebreaker ship fought them with sealed hatches and misdirection. The Gallant's crew fought back with stubbornness, and the memory of those 7 faces in their mess, and the 4 they had not saved. The corridor air tasted like tin and the electric tang of overspun circuits. In a central bay, they found what the Gatebreakers were building with their thefts. A jump matrix not sanctioned by any law but hunger, a spiderweb of fields that, if triggered, could hop a ship across space without a gate, fast, dirty, risky, a broken tunnel through the dark. This could tear a lane apart, Elson whispered, revolted but grudgingly admiring of the audacity. You could lose a sector to a miscalculation. Irid stepped into the center of the matrix and knelt, cords spilling around her like shadows made into jewelry. They did not build this, they bought it, from someone who dreams of empires with no doors. Ven covered the hatch. Jessa set charges. Mara watched Irid touch the matrix and felt a pressure behind her eyes as if the ship were leaning over her shoulder to see. "Can you deactivate it?" Mara asked. Irid's voice carried a fine tremor. "I can make it sleep, but if they have the code, they will wake it again." "Then we take the code," Mara said, and followed the line of pain to the Gatebreakers' bridge. The man who commanded the ship had a face that hated to be seen. He sat in a chair too big for anyone human and tried to fill it with the kind of cruelty that becomes a posture. He stood when Mara and Irid entered, and his hand went to his weapon in that inevitable, foolish way. "Don't," Mara said softly. He did because men like him mistake warning for weakness. The fight was not pretty. It was a compromise between the wish to be gentle and the requirement to live. When it was done, the Gatebreaker lay breathing because Mara had decided he should. Jessa's charges were set with the not-quite-love of a woman who knows the difference between destruction and justice. Irid pulled the code from the ship's stubborn brain and tucked it behind her teeth, as if she could hide it in her mouth like a child with a stolen sweet. They escaped as the Matrix died. a sigh that travels through metal at the speed of grief. The other two Gatebreaker ships scattered like roaches, living to try another day or to fear the day they didn't. The gallant limped away, bruised but whole. Reyes laughed once, sharp, surprising himself with it. Pale-patched skin and scalded blood for leaving. In the observation blister afterward, stars kept their quiet counsel. Irid stood, hands folded as if in prayer. Mara joined her, shoulder aching in a rhythm that matched the ship's hum. "You chose to spare him," Irid said, not accusing. "I didn't save him," Mara replied. "I saved myself from becoming what he wanted me to be." Irid's chords chimed. "I find I like this about you. You're enough like us to admit when you like something," Mara said. It was as close to teasing as she ever came. Irid considered that. "We are enough like you to learn to call it love and then to be sorry for how late we were." Mara didn't look away from the stars. "Do you miss your people?" "Yes," Irid answered immediately. "And no, my people might be a word for those who share my skin and my birth, or it might be a word for those who share my choices. Today, the word changes." Mara nodded. "People are the crew who show up." They shared silence, a good one. The weeks that followed were a trouble with teeth. The Gatebreakers retreated and regrouped and returned with reinforcements that tasted like new money. The gallant chased rumors that turned into ambushes and avoided ambushes that disguised themselves as rumors. They saved ships that had already learned what it means to fail and still move. The tribunal sent memos. Joran Vale sent requests for reports. The border learned the gallant silhouette and felt something in its bones, the way the human body recognizes a storm hairbreadths before the thunder. Irid began to laugh. It happened at first in small startles, as if she didn't trust her body to hold the sound. Stoker told a story about his grandmother who had believed that space was just the sky with the dark turned up, and when he imitated her setting an empty bowl on a windowsill to catch starlight for later. Irid made a sound that cut the room open and let in air. She laughed again when the twins argued over whether there was more poetry in the recoil of a plasma rifle or the curve of a well-cast grapnel. She laughed when Reyes cursed at the nav computer, and the computer, in a fit of petty personhood, refused to route them around a meteor swarm until she told it was a brave little brain and very handsome. It startled her. It touched Mara somewhere old and tender. One night, if nights can be measured on a ship where morning is a captain's order, they sat in the mess after the others had given their tired to sleep. The lights were down to a warmth that could have been the memory of a hearth. Irid picked up a ration bar and examined it like an artifact of a lost culture. "This is what you feed your heroes." Mara smiled. "Heroes don't require flavor." Irid's eyes softened. "Do you know why we have always been uneasy with you? Your people," Mara asked. "All people, your species happens to be the one I am currently falling into." She turned the bar in her fingers. "You refuse to understand when the story should be over. You keep adding pages. You reach your hands where the fire is and believe you can convince it to be candlelight." "Does it make us foolish?" Mara asked. Irid looked at her for a long time. "It makes you unbearable. It makes you beloved." Mara looked down at her hands, the small scars that had learned to be part of her. "It makes us tired." "Then you rest," Irid said, as if it were a decision they could choose together, like which star to call sweet by naming it home. They did not rest long. A convoy went missing behind the copper cloud of a nebula that had no name beyond the coordinates navigators whispered to make sure they weren't swallowed. It carried refugees from a planet whose mining rights had been purchased out from under them, people who had mattered less than the numbers in a ledger. The gallant took the lane that had been safe yesterday. They found wreckage, and one ship not quite broken, a colony hauler with its hull breached in 3 places and its main drive bleeding radiation like a fever. The Gatebreakers, or men just like them, drifted around it like vultures waiting for the bigger beast to finish. Distress codes fought the nebula's ion roar. The ship's name, Penance, shone stubbornly in letters scraped bare of pride. Boarding teams already inside, Reyes said. They're moving the refugees into cargo tow. Fast. Numbers? Mara asked. Hundreds, Kaido said softly. Maybe more. Stoker swore. Pell did not, which was worse. Mara looked at her crew and felt the shape of something like dread and decided she would not give it a chair at this table. We go in quiet. Irid, can you? I can make us a notch in the thunder, Irid answered. They landed in a maintenance bay flooded with dust that floated like glitter in broken stage lights. The air was breathable in the way that felt like a cup offered by a stranger whose kindness you didn't yet trust. They moved through corridors where the handprints of panic lived greasily on the walls. In a central hold, they found the refugees corralled like cattle, mouths covered, eyes wild. Men with guns kept them from remembering their own bravery. Men with tablets inventoried them. Mara lifted a hand. The twins nodded. Reyes and Elson circled. Kaido watched the lanes of movement the way a musician listens to a piece and understands when the note must be struck. Irid stepped forward and took a breath as if deciding how much of the room she wanted. When she spoke, it wasn't with words. The sound she made was older than human memory, a chord that hummed in bones and metal. The Gatebreakers froze as if the air had turned to glass around them. Not paralyzed precisely, hesitating, as if the moment had become a choice they did not know how to make. Mara moved into that choice, swift and precise, and the twins followed. In seconds, the hold belonged to people again, not to fear. The refugees stared, ragged, as if expecting the victory to evaporate and reveal itself a trick. The gallant's crew cut bindings. Pell walked from face to face, bestowing small nods of recognition, as if naming each person alive in her mind made the universe correct again. An old man took Mara's hand. We cannot pay you. Mara shook her head, eyes scanning the rafters for threat. You owe no one for being alive. Irid moved through the crowd, her chords chiming softly so children could find her. She knelt beside a boy whose cheeks were hollowed by a rationing that had been unkind. We are going, she said in a voice that had learned lullabies. Walk if you can, be carried if you can't, neither makes you less. Moving hundreds of people through a wounded ship while men with guns looked for a second round of theft is a logistical nightmare. It is also a kind of prayer. The Penance groaned. The nebula flexed its electric muscles. The Gatebreakers regrouped, angry in that particular way of men who have been told no for the first time in too long. Captain, Kaido said in Mara's ear, we've got company incoming. 2 ships heavy with friends. How long? Mara asked. Kaido did the inventory of impossible minutes. 3. Mara closed her eyes for a blink, and when she opened them, the world had decided to keep moving. Reyes, spin the stealth shroud to maximum. Stoker, give me speed, then more than that. Jessa, Ven, cover our retreat from the far corridor. Pell, triage on the move. Elson, you're a miracle, B3. They made it to the maintenance bay in a river of breath and feet. The gallant locked to the Penance like sisters sharing a blood transfusion. The first refugees stumbled through the umbilical and emerged into the gallant's warmth with a collective gasp that felt like the ship's hull expanding to hold more heart. Too many, Elson murmured, not despairing, just counting. Then we make rooms where there weren't, Mara said. The first Gatebreaker boarding team hit them 2 minutes and 20 seconds later, aiming to cut the umbilical and trap the refugees in a hold that could be vented to vacuum at leisure. Ven met them with a wall of disciplined fire, Jessa with a grin no one ever wanted aimed at them. Reyes rewrote access codes as fast as they were stolen, played cat and mouse with doors till the cat learned to be very hungry. Stoker coaxed the engine into a surge that felt like a heartbeat learning to gallop. Kaido threaded the gallant between the approaching ships as if he had been learning this particular dance all his life. Irid stood at the umbilical's mouth, eyes wide and soft. The children went to her. The old trusted her. The young looked at her and saw a story where they were not merely victims. She took hands, made room, listened when someone asked without words to be allowed to cry. Mara fought and moved and counted and prayed to gods. She did not acknowledge when anyone asked her what she believed. She watched the numbers of the refugees pass onto the gallant's manifest and did a deadly arithmetic with air and water and mass. The last few came through as the Gatebreakers made a final push. A projectile tore a ragged furrow along the umbilical's outer skin. The corridor pressure dropped, not catastrophically, but enough to put fear in the air. A child tripped. Irid scooped them up as if they were made of something the universe had promised to deliver intact. "Go," Mara shouted to Pel. "Get them in, get them seated, get them." Breathing, Pel said and vanished into the press of bodies. Mara turned back to the umbilical and found Irid standing not moving. "Irid," she said. Irid didn't answer. Her eyes had gone distant in that way that meant she was listening to something larger than nearby fear. "What?" Mara demanded raw. Irid blinked back into the room. "They have a breaker charge on the penance's drive. They mean to detonate it and make the blast look like an accident. If they do, the shock will rip the umbilical and pull half of us into the fire." "How long?" Mara asked, even though she knew. "Less than 1 minute," Irid said. Mara looked down the umbilical, then at the refugees crowded into her ship's spine. "There are choices you make with your mouth and choices you make with your bones. We cut the umbilical and run." "No," Irid said. Mara stared at her. "If we stay, we burn." "If we cut, they burn," Irid said, and her voice shook. "I cannot do it. Not the small ones who are still on the penance, the ones in the rear. Not the old woman who cannot move fast and refuses to be carried because her pride is the last thing she has left." Mara swallowed. "We can't save." Irid looked at her then, and Mara saw not pleading but a kind of fragile, furious hope. "You are human," Irid said. "Prove it." Mara closed her eyes for one long heartbeat. When she opened them, she was already moving. "Raise," she shouted. "Override the umbilical locks, manual control to me. Stoker, give me forward impulse on my mark. Kaido, brace for shear. Jessa, Ven with me." Irid didn't ask. She ran beside Mara back onto the penance, the umbilical quivering beneath their feet like a string drawn too tight. The hold was chaos. The refugees who'd been last were a crush of bodies still fighting toward the miracle. Jessa and Ven formed a wedge at the front and began moving people faster than fear. Irid moved like water around rock, finding channels, soothing panic with the calm that only lives in bodies that have already decided on sacrifice. Mara sprinted to the engine room. The breaker charge glowed with a pale, sullen light that knew its task and resented delay. She recognized the kind of rig, jury-built but effective, learning to love destruction like a new mouth loves taste. She didn't have the time or the tools. No one did. She did the thing that was left. She heaved the charge into a containment pod and jammed the manual release with her bare hands. The pod thumped into the launch tube. "Raise now." On the gallant, Rays did something beautiful and terrible with the ship's brain. The tube fired. The pod shot into the nebula, a pale stone thrown into a copper pond. Stoker, burn. The gallant pulled. The umbilical groaned as air tried to learn new ways to leave. Kaido held the ship steady with sheer refusal to do anything else. The refugees moved. Pel counted, swore, blessed. Jessa and Ven dragged, carried, shoved, apologized with their eyes. Irid stayed until the last two, a child with eyes too old and an old woman whose pride had finally agreed to be carried. Mara reached them as the breaker charge detonated in the nebula, a blossom of light like a false sunrise. The shock wave rolled through the penance and tried to tear everything made of hope to pieces. The umbilical shrieked as if metal could object. Mara grabbed the child. Irid took the old woman. They ran. They did not die. The gallant tore the umbilical free a half second after the last foot crossed the threshold. The maintenance bay on the pennants became a flower of fire. The shock wave rolled past like a god deciding to be merciful at the last possible moment only because someone had reminded it what mercy felt like. The gallant staggered, then gathered itself and fled into the nebula's welcoming roar. Behind them the pennants burned, but not forever. Ahead, the refugees sobbed in the way of people who have discovered survivors have obligations beyond breathing. The Gatebreakers chased, then gave up, then raged, then vanished to try again elsewhere. In the mess after, the Gallant broke all its rules for rationing and made a single good meal. Children fell asleep leaning on elbows, knowing the table would hold them. Pell bandaged an old woman's pride by asking about the best bread on her homeworld and telling her she would need to teach them the recipe because the border was starving for that kind of miracle. Elson found blankets where blankets had no right to be. Rays rewired the intercom so lullabies could be piped quietly through corridors. A simple melody his grandmother had sung to the engine at port so it would not be lonely. Kaido charted new lanes because the old would be watched, and his hands never quite stopped moving even when they pretended to be at rest. Mara stood at the hatch and watched the room become a small nation. Irid came to stand beside her, chords chiming, eyes tired and full. "This is the part where you tell me that what we did will not be enough," Irid said. Mara looked at her. "It won't." Irid nodded, "And that is why we will do it again." "Until the day we can stop," Mara said, "and then some days after that because we won't trust the quiet." Irid smiled, small and beautiful in the way stars are when you remember they are very far and very old and still willing to be light. "I chose you because you would carry me. I find you have made me lighter." Mara allowed herself a breath that did not have iron filings in it. "You made us heavier and we needed that. Our stories were floating away." They stood without speaking as the refugees' voices braided into something that would one day be called history. Headphone, if you're enjoying this story, take a second to like and subscribe. It really helps keep humanity's stories alive among the stars. The tribunal called. They always did when the numbers changed. Joran Vale's face arrived on the screen with the gravity of a man who cared and the caution of a man who knows caring can be used as a weapon against him. "I've received your preliminary report," he said to Mara. "The situation with the Gatebreakers is escalating." Mara nodded once because there was no point decorating truth. "They're using jump matrices not authorized by any known coalition. They're moving people, not just goods." Joran's mouth tightened. "Slavery, indenture with theater," Elson muttered from the corner. Irid stepped into the screen's field without hesitation. "They are also consolidating influence by controlling fear. They strike where gate authority is thin. They promise safe lanes for a price. Anyone who will not pay becomes an example." Joran glanced at Irid, the flicker of old prejudice struggling with new gratitude. "What do you need?" Mara said. "We need more ships and we need someone to make decisions faster than a committee. We need supplies we don't have to beg for. We need the authority to push beyond the lines you keep drawing because they are convenient." Joran exhaled, a man counting his coins before a hungry crowd. "I will do what I can." "Do more," Mara said, not unkindly, "or we will do it without you." He studied her, then nodded. "Send me the data on the jump matrix." "And Captain, the program review board asked me to convey their surprise at the efficacy of your pairing." Mara's eyebrow tilted like a small, necessary rebellion. "Tell them to stop making people into paperwork, and they'll experience many pleasant surprises." When the screen winked out, Irid leaned her shoulder against the bulkhead as if she'd been allowed to see how soft gravity could be. "He is not your enemy." "I know," Mara said. "He's a man asked to build bridges out of paper. I don't envy him, but I will not wait for his permits to cross the river." A week later, they found something they had not been looking for and could not leave behind. In the shadow of an old mining station, a ship drifted with its lights off and its hope on low battery, an Aeledri vessel, sleek and sorrowful. Irid went very still. Mara touched her elbow lightly. Yours, Irid shook her head. Ours, but not mine. She paused. We do not all agree on how to be broken. They docked. The air inside was thin and tasted like the afterbreath of a winter forest. The corridors were narrow and elegant. They found 5 Aeledri in the central chamber, gaunt in a way that looked graceful only to someone cruel. Their cords hung limp. Their eyes lit when they saw Irid, flaring not with the brightness of recognition but with the immediate cataloging of advantage. Kin, their leader said. The word had many meanings in Aeledri, and none of them were quite safe. Irid bowed by a measured smallness, neither submissive nor provocative. I am Irid. I am with a human ship. The leader's gaze flicked to Mara. We can tell. His tone wasn't contempt exactly. It was a weary curiosity with a coat of dust over it. We are seeking those who build unsanctioned matrices, Irid said. We have fragments of code. We need a maker. The leader spread his hands. Then you need us. We have relics the humans ignore because they do not sing in the frequencies their machines like. But why should we help a pair like yours? A traitor to pride and the human who leashes her. Mara felt the crew tense behind her. She held up a hand. No leashes on my ship, she said evenly. Only choices. The leader's cords clinked. He appraised Irid. And you choose this. Irid met his eyes. I choose not to drown where no shore will ever be built. Silence became a third creature in the room. The other Aeledri watched with a hunger that wore a polite face. We can help. The leader conceded at last, a little begrudgingly, a little impressed. But Aeledri help is not free. Mara said we don't have much to buy with. You pay with a promise, the leader said. When your kind decides what to do with us, do not make us paper. Let us be a people, even if we are an inconvenient people. Mara extended her hand. He looked at it like a tool he hadn't chosen to learn to use. Irid raised her hand and touched his wrist in their old greeting, and Mara lowered hers because some ceremonies aren't yours to own. The Aeledri gave them names, not the ones that would go on a warrant, but the kinds of names networks whisper to each other. The strata, the despot of the gray basin, the silent ones at the edges of Altair who kept their own gates. Most importantly, they gave them a pattern. The matrices weren't identical, they were cousins. Someone was selling kits and letting others color inside the lines. Why? Jessa demanded back on the gallant. Why would anyone hand people a wrench like that? Reyes shrugged, unhappy. Same reason anyone gives fire to a man who built his house from straw. He pays well until he doesn't. Irid traced the code on her slate with a long finger, memorizing its temper. This isn't just an economy. It's an idea. Someone believes the gates are tyranny. Someone's halfway right, Elson said. But the other half is how you keep ships from ripping open holes in space the same size as a city, and then calling it freedom. Pell sipped bitter tea. Who benefits most if the lanes become chaos? Mara stared at the star map, at the places where order made people imagine themselves safe, and the places where the liar who had invented peace had told the border to be quiet. Warriors and kings, she said, neither of which feed the hungry. The trail led to an industrial moon around a gas giant with rings like a crown spilled in pieces. The moon's night side was a lattice of factories and fires. The day side was white with frost. Ships came and went without filing anything resembling honesty. The gallant went tourist in a bad neighborhood, pretending to be a courier with important parcels and very little curiosity. Inside a warehouse hollowed into the moon's bone, they found a market of forbidden things. Weapons disguised as art. Codes packaged like sweet cakes. Matrices, partial and full, labeled as navigation enhancements. Men of 20 worlds hammered aching to profit. Mara walked among the stalls with Irid at her side and felt like throwing a match. Irid's chords chimed in a rhythm that said she was counting the breaths of those who would live or die because they had discovered a stall too late. They found the seller near the back, a woman with hair like static and a smile that never touched her eyes. She called herself Ree. She did not appear to be part of any conspiracy because people like her never do. She was the conspiracy, a mind that had decided her cleverness entitled her to open or close any door. Looking for something special, Ree asked, teeth in the sail. Mara nodded toward a compact matrix on a velvet pad. We heard these can save hours. And lives, Ree said smoothly. Fewer hours at hazard, get from hunger to harvest quicker, everyone wins. Irid picked up the device and weighed it. Her face did not change. Everyone except the Lanes, she said. Ree's gaze snapped to her, interest kindled. You're an Aeledri. I don't sell to your kind, trouble follows. Irid set the device down with care. Trouble follows you regardless of my shadow. Reconsidered Mara. You can't afford me. True, Mara said, so what you could do is answer a question for free. Ree's smile became a blade. That's not how markets work. Mara leaned in. You're making enemies who can build ships into a shape called vengeance. I don't recommend living at that address. Ree shrugged. I've lived at worse. Ask your question. Who's bankrolling you? Mara asked. Not the men who buy your toys. The ones who make sure your shipments get through gates, the ones who smooth out the rough edges of law, the ones who wrote your black line of code that even Irid flinched at. Irid didn't flinch, but she didn't deny the line existed either. Ree's laugh was quick, clever. You ask like a woman who remembers when worry used to be a lighter word. Who? Mara repeated. Ree toyed with a coin as if she planned to bribe herself. Let's call them the proprietors. They own more warehouses than you can burn. They believe freedom is what you hand people and then charge rent for. And where do they live? Jessa asked from behind Mara's left shoulder, voice low as a trigger. Ree looked amused. Everywhere and nowhere you can reach with a single ship and a heart full of courage. Irid tilted her head. What do you owe them? Ree's cheek twitched. A story. She looked at Mara. They came to me when I was nobody with a bag of ideas and a kettle of spite. They told me the gates were a leash. I believed them. They told me we could build new roads. I believed more. Mara's voice softened in that particular way that happens when anger makes room for grief. How many have you lost to your roads? Ree's eyes went distant. Enough to know I am wrong and too many to stop without making their deaths a museum for nothing. Then stop, Irid said, simple as winter. Ree stared at her. And be what? Alive, Irid said, silence balanced on a wire. Somewhere in the warehouse a bell rang that wasn't a bell. It was the alarm of men who worried about laws that only visited on holidays. Ree's hand drifted toward the device. Mara's hand drifted toward her weapon. Get out, Ree said softly. Take whatever you can carry, but leave before the proprietor's eyes arrive. Mara held her gaze a second longer than safe, because some moments have to be measured even when they hurt. Then she nodded. Come with us. Ree smiled, and it was the saddest thing in that building full of pretty machines. I can't, not yet, but I will send you something you will need. They left with a crate of matrices that Irid had quietly disarmed and repurposed into a set of small, portable shrouds that could hide people instead of crimes. Rays, whose hands were made of curiosity and gentle theft, lifted a box of coded keys Ree would not miss until morning. Elson found a barrel of protein paste and declared a victory that tasted like cardboard and triumph. Back on the Gallant, a message arrived from Ree. A packet of code labeled for when the light lies. Rays probed it like a doctor poking a wound that might be healing wrong. He smiled, grudging. She's good. This will let us see through false gate beacons. Forward it to Joran, Mara said, and then let's go knock on the proprietor's door. Do we know the address? Kaido asked. Irid closed her eyes. She listened. She reached fingers that were not fingers into the pattern of lanes, of lies, of money-wearing masks. Yes, she said. An old relay station near Altair, officially abandoned, unofficially loved. They found it nestled in a graveyard of satellites and thwarted dreams, an ugly cylinder of rust and ambition. The Gallant approached as cargo, then as plague, then as boredom. When they were close enough to touch the station's skin with reverence or weapons, Mara made her choice. "Dock," she said. They docked. Inside, the station felt like corporate brochures never smell. It smelled like sweat and panic and the money that clings to walls as a film. Security teams moved in patterns designed by people who trusted patterns. The Gallant's crew moved in patterns designed by necessity. Irid went ahead like a rumor, finding routes that maps did not admit existed. They found the heart of the operation not at the station's mathematical center but at its social one, a control room with windows like lies and consoles like altars. On a central screen, lanes lit and dimmed, gates pulsed. Men and women in crisp uniforms managed chaos as if chaos paid a salary. At the center, a man in a suit that had opinions stood with his hands at the small of his back and looked over his kingdom as if it were inevitable. Mara stepped into the room and made the terrible mistake of telling the truth. "It ends today." The man turned. His smile was the same species as Rhee's, bred for success in cages. "You must be Captain Vance. We've been watching your progress. Such determination." "You sell tools that kill," she said. "I sell access," he corrected. "People demand it. I provide what governments hoard. Lanes stingy with passage, gates taxed by men who never travel. I liberate those who cannot pay the slow toll." Irid stepped forward. "You liberate them into the teeth of physics, and when their families ask, you offer a refund." He looked at her with something like fascination, as if he were the sort of collector who discovered the rarest thing in a market he'd grown bored of. An Aeledri paired with a human. How novel. He tilted his head. "You do know your people were once gatekeepers of a sort. You understand the logic of monopoly." Irid's voice softened in that dangerous way that happens to water when it decides to be ice. "We understand the logic of hubris." Mara raised her weapon. Security lifted theirs. The room held its breath, poised to become a story the border would tell differently depending on who dragged the microphone to the campfire. Then re-emerged from a side door, hair more static, eyes more tired, hands empty. She looked at the suited man, at Mara, at Irid, at the crew, and made a choice. "Shut it down," she said to the man in the suit. He arched a pitying brow. "You don't give orders here, Rhee." "I gave you the code you needed," she said quietly. "You let me think it would change the lanes. It changed who could be bought." He laughed once. "Everything can be bought." Rhee turned to Mara and tossed her a small device. "This will kill the station's bespoke beacon network for 10 minutes. After that, we all drown in reinforcements. I can't give you longer, but maybe you can make 10 minutes matter." Mara caught the device. She didn't ask questions. "Raise." He took it, wired it into the system with a grace that would shame saints, and smiled with all his teeth. Lights out. The station's windows lied differently. False beacons died. Unlawful lanes collapsed into honest light. In the sudden darkness of misdirection removed, the station's power flickered. The suited man's smile collapsed from architecture to accident. "Do you think this changes anything?" he demanded. "There will be another station, another network. You cannot conquer momentum with one good day." Mara didn't lower her weapon. "Maybe not, but people have to see you bleed." He moved, foolish and predictable. Irid moved, tragic and necessary. The shot did not kill him. It killed his certainty. He collapsed, clutching a shoulder that would hold a scar, not because he'd fought, but because someone had refused to keep playing his game. Security broke in the way of rent soldiers whose employers had not been as generous as their contracts promised. Some threw down guns. Some fired wildly and learned regret. The Gallant's crew kept the room. Elson locked doors. Jessa and Ven provided consequences. Kaido sent a message across the verge that said, "If you're waiting for permission to fight back, here it is." Rhee slid down a wall, exhausted. 10 minutes, she warned, voice ragged. Mara nodded. She turned to the consoles. "Blast it to the border. Names, numbers, routes. Make the proprietors famous." Raise worked. Data poured into the lanes like a confession. Screens across stations and ships lit with maps of greed. Joran Vale called on a channel that should have been clogged by politics, and wasn't, because sometimes the universe found itself in the mood for irony. "What in God's tired name are you doing, Captain?" "Burning a house," Mara said, "so we can see where the fire spreads." "Understood," Joran said, and Mara loved him in that moment for being a man who recognized that condemnation could wait its turn. "We'll send ships." 10 minutes, Ree whispered again, as if the number itself had become a litany. They held for 9. At 9:30, the station shuddered as ships with loyalists arrived. At 9:75, the Gallant blew a hole in a bulkhead large enough to fly a corvette through. At 10, they were gone, station alarms waking up to a dream that promised they would be punished for later. The border lit like a constellation with anger. The proprietors found themselves prey instead of predator, their accounts frozen, their stations visited by people who had carried too much grief for too long. The Gatebreakers found the lanes less friendly, the markets less safe, their suppliers less polite. The refugees on the Gallant were delivered to a station where nobody asked them to justify their breathing. Joran sent a message that only said, "Thank you, more." In the quiet after a storm that refused to admit it was over, the Gallant floated near a blue-white star and pretended to be a leaf. The crew slept. Pell slept. Reyes slept with one hand on a console as if convinced it might attempt mischief if left unsupervised. Elson sat awake guard whose mercy was to notice when others were at peace. Mara and Irid stood at the blister and watched the star be itself. Mara's shoulder hurt less. Irid's cords lay along her back like a waterfall frozen long enough to be admired. "I was forced to choose a human," Irid said, as if reciting a ritual and making it new. "Now I cannot imagine the stars without this particular one." Mara looked at her, all the possible answers crowding in her mouth. She picked the smallest and truest. "Same." Irid's hand found Mara's alien bones fitting human fingers as if whittled for this purpose by a patient maker. They stood like that for a long time. Outside, space kept doing its job of being big and cold and full of reasons to despair. Inside, 2 people and a ship and a crew and the refugees sleeping around them made a counterargument. Then the call came that would write the next day. A convoy request. A colony under threat. A corridor where the Gatebreakers had found a new tactic involving a gravity well and a lie. The kind of message that arrives and does not allow the word, no, to be in the first sentence that follows. Mara squeezed Irid's hand once, then let go because saving people requires the use of both arms. She called the crew. The Gallant woke, groaned, stretched like an old dog, wagged a tail only its captain knew how to see, and accepted another day. They burned for the coordinates faster than fuel allowed because miracles also require math. The convoy was smaller than expected and more damaged than anyone had hoped. The Gatebreakers had learned from past scars. They used drones now, dozens of them, each a small, vicious brain attached to a weapon that did not require mercy. The convoy's defense grid had been shredded. The gate beacon had been spoofed. The gravity well tug had been recalibrated to pull at human nerve instead of metal. Irid took a breath and listened. Reyes found Ree's code and saw through the lies. Kaido adjusted their path as if he had a hand on the sky and could nudge it to be kinder. Jessa and Ven became poetry written in recoil. Pell turned the mess into a field hospital. Elson whispered to ration packs until they pretended to taste like something a child would trust. Mara did the thing that had become her signature. She went where fear told her not to and asked it to move. The Gallant knifed into the drone's swarm and spun a web of interference using Irid's altered matrices. The drones confused friend for foe. The Gatebreakers found their weapons turned toward one another. An orchestra suddenly reminded it had been playing the wrong symphony. The convoy limped toward safety. The Gallant's shields bled. The hull sang a song made of stress and promise. A point defense battery attempted to be too clever. It would have succeeded if the Gallant were not the kind of ship that had learned to be stubborn. Mara ordered the risky burn that would get them between the convoy and a blast that a poet would later describe as too much star in too small a room. The burn took them into a wake of radiation that would etch itself into their bones and be paid for years hence in tremors and small aches. You do not always get to choose the debts you will carry. You can choose to count them. The convoy lived. The Gallant did too, by narrow margins. The Gatebreakers did not. Or if some did, they left messages that sounded like rage being taught how to be grief. In the quiet after, Mara found Irid in the blister. The Aeledri's hands shook imperceptibly, a tiny betrayal of control that meant the day had been very long indeed. Mara stood beside her and did not tell her it was all right. She said, "I'm here, which is the only thing that matters." Irid exhaled. "My people will write about this one day." "Write about what?" Mara asked. Irid's chords chimed. "About doors, about how sometimes they're kept by monsters, and sometimes by men who wish to be kings, and sometimes by those who are too tired to notice a hand banging from the other side. And about how, sometimes, humanity kicks them off the hinges and then holds them open until their arms break and then uses their broken arms to wedge them open anyway and then says, 'Come in.'" Mara tried to snort a laugh and failed into something warmer. "We're not the only ones." Irid nodded. "No, but you are the ones who insist. Do you regret choosing me?" Mara asked, because sometimes even a captain deserves to be weak. Irid turned and touched Mara's cheek lightly, a gesture learned from watching humans comfort each other and stealing it without apology. "I regret not having chosen you sooner," she said. Mara closed her eyes for a heartbeat that felt too big for her ribs. "We have a long way to go." Irid leaned her forehead briefly against Mara's. "Good, I have learned to like roads." News of the relay station scandal spread as Ree had promised it would. Ships that had been paid to look away learned to look back. The proprietors found their accounts cut and their partners explaining distances that were now measured in opportunities lost. The Gatebreakers, those not already learning humility from hospital beds or cells, tried to coalesce under a new symbol and discovered their own reflection wearing shame. Joran called. His office looked less tidy, his hair had learned to be human. "We're forming a task group, independent, fast, willing to move inside the gray. We need the Gallant as anchor." Mara's throat tried to be dignified and failed into feeling. "Yes," she said. He hesitated. "And the program review board asked. This pairing has become a flagship example. They want to assign more Aeledri to crews." Irid's eyes went thoughtful, then amused. "Tell them we are not spare parts." Joran smiled despite the hour. "I will, but I will also tell them you work." "We don't work," Mara said. "We live. Sometimes living looks like work." He nodded, understood. When his face vanished, the Gallant's crew gathered in the mess. They shared what hope tastes like, a thing that is not sweet but filling. They stayed up too late building a list of the ships they would be when they were old and allowed to tell lies about their youth. Irid told a story about how her people named the stars after actions verb tenses can't hold. Mara told a story about a bay on a blue world where the water shook hands with the land, and how the day she left it, she told the sea she'd be back, and how the sea hadn't answered because it didn't have to, it was already in her. Days became a rope they climbed. Rescues, raids, quiet transports that went off without incident and tasted like a miracle because of that. A small colony that learned to dig wells where the ground said none existed. A medical ship that finally reached its destination in time to call it prevention instead of triage. Fights and days without fights. Laughter, sleep, waking. Irid became a part of the Gallant the way moss becomes a part of stone, not covering it but making it truer. She stood watches, adjusted fields, sang to the ship when Reyes was tired. She learned to play a card game the twins swore no one but blood could master, and she beat them so soundly they accused her of reading the card's thoughts. She sat with Pell when a patient did not make it, and listened to the silence without pretending it said anything it did not. She wrote a song in her own language and would not sing it until she knew the words she had borrowed from human mouths had learned to be comfortable there. Mara watched all this and allowed herself the rare indulgence of gratitude that did not immediately turn into a list of things still required. The worst day came like a snake in a garden, beautiful and poisonous. They were escorting a small convoy through a corridor they had cleaned of pirates twice. The stars were polite. The engines were content. Then space decided to be rude and tore open in a way that meant someone somewhere had done reckless math. A jump matrix fired too close, its wake forcing the gallant sideways into a gravity hiccup. The convoy scattered. The gallant collided with a debris field that had been very patient until this moment. Alarms became a chorus. The hull screamed. Stoker yelled, "Rupture on deck 3." And Elson shouted, "Seal." And the ship decided it would do what it could and hoped its people would meet it halfway. Mara was 3 corridors away when she heard the sound every captain learns in the worst classroom. The breath pulled out of a room that needs it. She sprinted, catching handholds like promises, and found the breach. Through the hole, the stars looked indifferent. Inside, Irid held a patch plate against the tier with both hands, cords floating around her like a halo torn up by wind. A young crewman too new, was pinned under a beam. "Help him," Irid said, a command that would have broken anyone else's voice but not hers. Mara grabbed the beam. The vacuum had decided to share itself. Her lungs tried to invent a new way to function. Jessa and Ven arrived, hands and feet in prayers. Together they lifted. Pell pulled the boy free. Irid held the patch with everything she did not have to spare. Rays slammed the emergency seal toggle, the plate locked, the air stopped leaving. Mara fell backward and coughed. The boy screamed and learned how sweet oxygen can be. Irid slumped, her cords drifted. The look on her face was a strange, soft thing, relief braided with distance. Mara crawled to her, hands shaking. "Stay," she said, human foolishness thinking it can order life. Irid smiled, small. "I am here." "You're bleeding," Mara said, because that was a sentence her mouth could handle. "I will make less of it soon," Irid promised. Pell arrived, brisk, gentle, already opening a kit. "Let me be rude," she told Irid, and Irid allowed it to be done. They lived. The boy lived. The breach was sealed. The convoy regained courage and gathered. The gallant limped to a friendly dock and spent 3 days being taught patience by a mechanic who did not put up with ships that believed themselves immortal. On the 3rd night, when the ship's hum had learned to be comfortable again, Irid and Mara sat in the blister, not quite touching. "I used to think choosing a human partner was a sentence," Irid said quietly. "Now I think it is a way of speaking a language I had not known how to ask about." Mara nodded. "I used to think partnership was about covering one another's weak spots. Now I think it is about teaching each other what strength is for." Irid looked at her. "What is it for?" "Not dying," Mara said, "and not letting anyone die alone." They slept then, not long, not without interruption. The next day began not because the calendar said so, but because the universe decided it would keep asking the question, "Who will you be today?" They kept answering. When the final confrontation arrived, and of course one does, stories like to pretend they are music. The gallant found herself at the mouth of a gate held by men who had learned nothing and forgot less. The proprietors had rebuilt their network in a place that believed it was safe, surrounding themselves with a fleet of hired muscle. They had one of the new matrices, sleek and hungry, a beast waiting to be fed a city. Mara gathered her crew. "We send the data to Joran," she said. "We go in first anyway." The crew nodded. Rays kissed his console with his fingertips. Stoker patted the engine with an apology for what he was about to ask. Kaido whispered to the stars. The twins loaded the last of the just-in-case shells. Pell tied her hair back tight enough to keep death out of her eyes. Elson muttered a blessing he swore he didn't believe in. Irid stepped in front of Mara. If we do not survive this, I am glad that we did the days before. That is the truth I choose to wear." Mara touched Irid's brow lightly with 2 fingers, a benediction stolen from a religion she did not claim. "If we do not survive this, then the days after will hold our names whether we say it is allowed or not." They went. The battle was a demo of good behavior for gods. The gallant danced among larger ships like a knife among clubs. Rhee's code showed false beacons as the lies they were. The gallant's altered matrices made drones forget their purpose and remember their maker's incompetence. The gate thrummed, ready to do harm at a scale that would leave history dented. Mara made the decision she would regret if she didn't and accept if she did. She took the gallant into the heart of the Matrix. It was a place no one had designed for visitors. It was a machine's dream about what a throat should be. The gallant slid into it with a grace that felt like sin. Irid stood at the console and sang, a song no human throat could shape, a melody that told the Matrix it was tired, that it had done enough, that it was allowed to sleep. And the Matrix believed her. It shut down one layer at a time, death as gentle as turning out lights in rooms where no one was reading anymore. The proprietor's fleet realized what was happening and tried to stop it. The gallant took hits that felt like loss, pieces of her remembered younger days and wished to go back. The crew held her together by wanting it more than physics wanted her to break. Mara watched the status boards bleed and said the only honest prayer a captain can say, "Hold." They did. When the Matrix died, the gate went quiet. The fleet faltered. The gallant emerged like a swimmer who had been down longer than the body allows and refused to call the air she found stolen. The task group arrived, late and exactly on time. Joran's voice cracked across the lanes like thunder. "Stand down, it ends." It ended slowly, the way rot stops spreading when you finally remove the nail it has been chasing. The proprietors were gathered, not all, never all, but enough. Rhee disappeared into the parts of the border where repentance has work to do. The Gatebreakers scattered. The refugees found planets that would have them. The gallant returned to her patrols, smaller promises now, the kind with faces. On a quiet watch, Mara and Irid stood again in the blister where their friendship had learned to be a story someone could tell without weeping. Below them, a fertile world turned, its continents scattered like gifts for a party no one would regret attending. They had helped convoy 3,000 settlers there, each with a satchel full of seeds and a spine full of stubborn. Irid leaned her head on Mara's shoulder the way a woman leans into another when there is nothing else in this moment to require their hands. "We did not conquer," she said. "No," Mara agreed. "We endured." Irid's lips lifted, and in enduring we made a door where there had not been one. Mara turned and looked at her, and in the reflection of the blister's glass, they seemed like 2 lights leaning toward one another, not brighter together, not diminished, simply refusing to be alone. They did not live happily ever after because no one does. They lived, which is harder and better and requires the maintenance of hope like an engine. They answered calls. They carried people. They stood in rooms where the air was thin and decided to breathe anyway. And one day, when her hair had learned a little gray and her scars had accepted their place in the conversation, Mara stood on a stage where the border's people had come to speak the names of the ships that had saved them. Irid stood beside her, cords woven into a crown by children with sticky hands. The crowd cheered not because heroes stood before them, but because they recognized themselves, stubborn, flawed, alive. The shouting faded to a hum like a ship's purr. Mara spoke the only words that felt honest. And that day the galaxy learned humanity doesn't conquer, it endures. Headphone, thank you for listening. Until next time, stay human, stay unbroken.